The wind carried a bitter chill that morning, slicing through the quiet streets of the small town like a blade. Dust swirled along the worn wooden sidewalks, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and smoke from distant chimneys. In the dim light of dawn, a lone carriage creaked along the main road, its wheels pressing into ruts long formed by the endless passage of wagons and riders. Inside, a young woman sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon, though her heart trembled with a fear she could not speak aloud. She had never ridden this far from home, and yet she was moving toward a life she neither chose nor understood. Her parents had abandoned her, leaving her behind in a world that demanded children to carry on their names and fortunes. For years they had looked upon her with a cold disappointment that weighed more heavily than any words could. Their rejection was sharp, a wound that cut deep into her spirit. She had been told, plainly and without mercy, that her inability to bear a child had made her useless to them. And so, with little more than the clothes on her back and the fragile remnants of hope in her chest, she had been sent away. The journey had been long, the land stretching endlessly in shades of ochre and rust, dotted with mesquite and cactus that bent under the unforgiving sun. Along the trail she had glimpsed small settlements, blackened stumps of buildings abandoned in haste, and the occasional rider who regarded her carriage with wary suspicion. Stories of the wilds beyond the town had filtered back to her through whispered gossip and rumors, tales of bandits, of unmarked graves, and of the Apache people who roamed the lands with an independence that frightened the townsfolk. Her heart had clenched each time she heard the word, for she knew that the house she was bound for belonged to a man who carried that name with quiet authority, a widower, feared for his strength, his reputation, and the stories that followed him like shadows. Yet even in the fear there was a strange curiosity. She had heard that he was a man of honor, that he held the respect of those who knew him, and that he treated his family with a loyalty that bordered on legend. There was a story, one she could scarcely believe, of how he had once saved a neighboring homestead from a gang of outlaws, armed with little more than a bow and the steady aim of a man who feared nothing. And now she was to enter his home, a stranger crossing the threshold into a life entirely unknown. The carriage stopped abruptly at the edge of a clearing where a modest home stood, framed by the skeletal branches of cottonwood trees. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the faint sound of a water wheel turning in a nearby creek marked the rhythm of life in this remote place. She could see him then, standing tall near the door, his frame broad and commanding even at a distance. His eyes were sharp, observing her with a depth that seemed to measure the truth of her being before a single word was exchanged. She felt her chest tighten as she descended the steps of the carriage, each movement weighted by the knowledge that her fate was now tethered to this man. He spoke, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority, welcoming her into his home with words that were few but deliberate. There was no malice in them, no hint of mockery, only a measured strength that made her pulse quicken. She noticed the scar along his forearm, the remnants of a life lived close to danger, and the careful way he held himself, a balance of vigilance and restraint. Inside the house, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, cooked meat, and the faint trace of wild herbs. The rooms were simple, each item in its place, a testament to a man who respected order yet lived surrounded by the untamed world outside. She felt small in the vastness of the home, a stranger thrust into a world where she had no claim, no voice to shape the life ahead. He offered her a seat by the hearth, and though his eyes remained steady on her, there was a patience in his gaze that seemed almost unnatural for a man rumored to be so fierce. She hesitated before speaking, unsure of what was expected of her, unsure if she would ever belong here at all. And then he spoke again, asking about her journey, about the town she had left behind, about the silence that must have pressed against her soul these past years. She answered cautiously, each word measured, knowing that the wrong tone might be her undoing. As the day wore on, she began to notice the details of the household, the worn rug by the hearth, the handmade tools neatly arranged in the corner, the pottery that held wildflowers gathered from the surrounding hills. There was care here, a life lived with intention, and yet the shadow of loss hung over everything. She realized slowly that she had been placed not just into any home, but into a sanctuary shaped by grief and resilience. The man who had welcomed her was more than the story suggested. He was a human being bound by duty, memory, and perhaps a longing that he hid beneath his composed exterior. Night fell with a quiet suddenness, the sky bleeding into shades of violet and deep indigo, and the stars emerged one by one, tiny points of light above the vast open land. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the songs of the night creatures, and the girl felt both awe and isolation in the same breath. She had never slept in a place so far removed from her own world, so removed from the life she had known, and the uncertainty of what tomorrow would bring pressed against her like the weight of the dark. She lay awake that night, listening to the creaking of the old house and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. Thoughts swirled in her mind, memories of the parents who had turned their backs on her, the carriage ride that had brought her here, and the enigmatic figure of the man who now shared this space with her. Fear and curiosity tangled in her chest, each emotion sharp and unyielding. She wondered what they expected of her, what role she was to play in a life that had been built in solitude, and whether she could find a place within it without losing herself entirely. In the early hours before dawn, a sound startled her, a quiet shift of movement, careful and deliberate. She peered into the dim light, and there he stood again, not imposing but watchful, as if he sensed her thoughts and sought to meet them halfway. There was a complexity in his expression, a mixture of caution, concern, and something unspoken that hinted at the stories she had yet to learn. The space between them seemed to hum with tension, a silent understanding that her arrival was the beginning of something neither of them could fully predict. Outside, the world remained vast and wild, a land of endless possibilities and unspoken dangers. And inside, the young woman sat quietly, the fire casting flickering shadows across her face, wondering if she had the strength to face what lay ahead. The man, the widower of whispered reputation, observed her with a steady gaze that seemed to measure the courage hidden beneath her fear. Neither spoke for long, for words could not yet capture the weight of the future stretching before them, a future shaped by loss, resilience, and the fragile hope of something entirely new. As the first light of dawn began to touch the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of amber and rose, she realized that her life had shifted irreversibly. She had been taken from the world she knew, cast into the unknown, and entrusted to a man whose past was as untamed as the land surrounding his home. The thought both thrilled and terrified her, and she knew that the coming days would demand more of her than she could yet imagine. The wind carried with it a promise and a warning, rustling the leaves outside as if nature itself acknowledged the arrival of a new chapter. She could not know yet what awaited her, the quiet moments of understanding, the challenges that would test her spirit, or the bonds that might form in the most unexpected of places. All she could do was breathe, steady her trembling hands, and step forward into a life that had been chosen for her, even if the path was shrouded in uncertainty. And so, as the morning sun climbed higher, spilling light across the rugged landscape, she rose from her seat by the fire, aware of the eyes that followed her every movement, aware of the weight of expectation pressing down, and yet filled with a small, stubborn spark of hope. She did not know what lay ahead, whether acceptance, struggle, or something beyond her imagining, but she knew that her story had begun, not in the town she had left, nor in the empty halls of her childhood, but here, in the home of the Apache widower, where every step would define who she was meant to become. Morning settled slowly over the land, the sunlight creeping through the cracks of the wooden shutters and spilling across the floorboards. The girl moved quietly, careful not to disturb the rhythm of the household, which seemed both unfamiliar and oddly comforting. The man had already risen. She could hear the low hum of his voice as he tended to the morning chores outside. There was a steady precision in his movements, a measured care that suggested years of labor and a life lived close to the land. She wondered if he ever rested, or if the weight of the past drove him to keep moving, even when the world itself might have begged him to pause. Breakfast was simple but hearty. Cornbread warmed by the fire, dried meat, and strong coffee that smelled of smoke and roasted grain. The girl ate in silence, watching the man as he sat across from her, his posture upright, his eyes scanning the room as if he was always aware of every sound, every shift of air. She noticed the faint tremor in his hands when he lifted the cup to his lips, A small sign that beneath the strong exterior there was a man who carried burdens invisible to the casual observer. For the first time, she sensed that fear alone would not define this home, that the man was more than the rumors suggested, and that there were secrets buried here, truths she was not yet ready to uncover. After breakfast, he led her outside into the wide open space behind the house. The land stretched in gentle rises and dips, broken by a creek that glimmered in the morning light. There were fields marked by neat rows of corn and squash, and beyond them, the wild brush that marked the edge of untamed country. He handed her a basket and gestured toward the garden, explaining how the plants grew and how to tend to them. His voice was firm but patient, each word chosen with care, each instruction precise. She worked quietly, the soil cold and rough beneath her fingers, her hands slowly acquiring the scent of earth and life. She found herself stealing glances at him as he moved about the property, how his eyes seemed to notice everything, how his stance suggested both readiness and restraint. There was a story written in the lines of his face, a history she had only begun to imagine. She wondered what had led him to this place, to this life of solitude, and what grief had hardened him into the man she now served under. He spoke little of himself, offering only fragments when she pressed for answers. Once she asked about his wife, the woman whose absence had left a hollow in the home. He paused, the sound of the creek filling the silence before he replied. She learned that she had been gentle and strong, and that her passing had changed the rhythm of the household forever. The girl felt the weight of that loss, the sense that stepping into this home was not just a matter of survival, but of navigating the echoes of grief that lingered like shadows. By midday the sun had climbed high, casting long patterns of light and shade across the fields. The girl's arms ached from the labor, her back stiff from bending over the soil, but she felt a strange sense of belonging in the work itself. The man watched her from time to time, his eyes assessing, never judging, and she felt a cautious trust beginning to form. There was a rhythm here, a balance between independence and guidance, between silence and shared effort that she had never known. As the day wore on, she began to notice small things about the home, the way the doors fit snugly in their frames, the way the wood smelled of pine and smoke, the quiet hum of life that persisted even in the absence of others. She saw his habits in tiny details, the way he sharpened his knives with care, how he kept the firewood stacked perfectly, how he moved around the property as if he had memorized every stone and root. These observations made her realize that this was not a home built hastily or without thought. It was a place shaped by necessity and memory, a fortress of both protection and solitude. Late in the afternoon, the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of smoke from a distant fire, and with it came a sense of unease. The girl looked toward the hills beyond the fields and saw figures moving along the ridges riders, perhaps though they were too far to tell. Her heart quickened, and she felt a tremor of the old fear that had ridden with her on the carriage. The man noticed her glance and followed it, his expression tightening slightly. He did not speak immediately, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands flexed unconsciously. "Stay close," he said finally, his voice low and deliberate. "There are travelers on the ridge." "I do not know their intent." The girl nodded, feeling both fear and fascination at the way he spoke, as though danger was something he expected and yet faced without panic. She watched as he moved toward the edge of the field, scanning the horizon with a practiced eye. There was a caution in his movements that suggested he had faced threats before, and a calm precision that suggested he had survived them. She realized that the life she had been sent to join was not merely one of solitude and labor, it was a life lived on the edge of the unknown, where vigilance was as important as breath. As evening approached, the sky darkened to deep purples and blues, and the first stars began to appear. The girl helped gather water from the creek, the cool liquid refreshing against her hands, and carried it back to the house. The man followed silently, and for a moment their shadows stretched long across the land, merging and separating as the light shifted. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a recognition of shared effort, of shared endurance, even if trust had not fully formed. Dinner was quiet. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows across the room. They ate slowly, the taste of food grounding her after the tension of the day. Outside, the wind carried the faint sounds of the wild, the cry of an owl, the rustle of branches, the distant howl of a coyote. The girl thought about the stories she had heard of this land, of the Apache who roamed it with fierce independence, and realized that she was living among the echoes of those stories, witnessing them in the quiet strength of the man before her. After the meal, he showed her the small library of the house, a collection of worn books and journals, some written in languages she could not read, others in careful, flowing script. He explained that knowledge was as important as strength, that the past could teach lessons that the land itself could not. She ran her fingers along the spines, feeling a sense of awe at the history contained within these pages, and a strange comfort in the idea that even in a home shaped by loss, there was room for learning and growth. Night deepened. The girl found herself drawn to the window, watching the stars flicker above the quiet hills. She thought of her parents, of the home she had left behind, and of the uncertain path that had brought her here. Her heart ached with both fear and hope, a mixture she had never known in equal measure. She wondered what tomorrow would bring, what trials she would face, and whether she could find a place in this world that seemed both harsh and beautiful. The man joined her at the window, his presence quiet but steady. He did not speak at first, letting her thoughts drift into the night. Then, slowly, he shared fragments of his past, a memory of his wife, a story of a hunt that went awry, a lesson learned from hardship and solitude. His voice was calm, measured, but beneath it there was a depth of emotion that caught her by surprise. She realized that, beneath the reputation of strength and fear, there was a human being shaped by love, loss, and the land he called home. "You must understand," he said finally, "that life here is not gentle. The land does not forgive mistakes easily, and neither do the people who live upon it. But there is also a chance to belong if you are willing to learn and endure. Do you understand?" She nodded, the weight of his words settling into her chest. She did understand, even if the full measure of what lay ahead was beyond her grasp. She had been thrust into this world, cast into the life of a man whose past was as untamed as the land itself, and now she had to find her place within it. A sudden sound drew their attention, a distant shout carried on the wind, abrupt and sharp, followed by the thrum of hooves against the earth. The girl's pulse leapt. The man moved swiftly, grabbing a lantern and gesturing for her to stay close. Shadows stretched across the land as he stepped outside, the firelight from the house flickering against his features, revealing both resolve and a shadow of concern. The night held its breath. The unknown pressed close, and the girl realized that this was only the beginning. She had entered the home of the Apache widower into a life shaped by solitude, strength, and unspoken grief. The land around them was alive with possibility and danger, and every choice, every movement could shift the balance of what was to come. Inside, she stood near the doorway, heart pounding, unsure of what the night would bring, aware that her life had changed in ways she could not yet name. And outside, he scanned the horizon, alert and unflinching, ready to face whatever shadows stirred in the darkness. The wind whispered across the fields, carrying with it the scent of smoke, earth, and wild herbs. The girl shivered, not from cold, but from the knowledge that she had stepped into a world where fear, courage, and hope were intertwined, and where every moment could define the life she would come to lead. She did not know what awaited them in the darkness, or what challenges would rise with the sun, but she understood one truth with clarity: her story had only just begun. And the night waited, patient and silent, holding its secrets close, leaving the girl and the widower to face what would come next, together yet uncertain, in a land as untamed and boundless as the hearts they carried. The next morning arrived quietly. Though the land seemed to hum with attention, the girl could feel even in the still air. She awoke to the smell of coffee and wood smoke drifting through the open window. The man was already outside, moving among the fields with an ease born of years spent in rhythm with the land. She dressed quickly and followed him, carrying a basket for the morning's work, though she could feel a new kind of unease coiling in her stomach. The night had left questions unanswered, and the distant shout and the sound of hooves from the previous evening lingered in her mind. As she approached the fields, she noticed a figure on the far ridge, a lone rider, cloaked and distant, moving along the crest of the hill with a steady, deliberate pace. The man saw her glance and stiffened, lowering his gaze to the earth for a moment, as if weighing the decision to speak. When he did, his voice was low but steady. "Travelers come this way sometimes," he said. "Not all are welcome. Some bring more than words." She swallowed, her fingers tightening around the handle of the basket. The stories she had heard of the wild land and the Apache rang in her mind, tales of danger, of men who claimed the territory as their own, of strangers who might test the quiet strength of those who lived here. But there was something more in his tone, a caution that suggested knowledge of a threat she could not yet name. The day passed with its work, though every sound beyond the immediate tasks, the rustle of brush, the distant cry of a bird, the shifting of shadows across the fields made her pulse quicken. She tried to focus on her hands, on the feel of the soil, on the rhythm of planting and tending, but the tension never fully left her. She began to notice small signs, footprints in the mud near the creek that did not belong to the usual wildlife, the way the wind seemed to carry whispers she could not place, the glint of something metallic half buried in the dirt. Each detail hinted at a world beyond the immediate safety of the home, a world that waited with patience and quiet menace. The man moved among the fields with a practiced eye, his presence both commanding and protective. When she stumbled or hesitated, he was there with guidance, showing her how to steady the basket, how to bend her body to the soil, how to read the land in ways she had never imagined. And yet, despite his instruction, there was a distance, a part of him that remained unspoken, untouched by the day's work. She sensed that he carried secrets not meant for her ears, memories that weighed him down, and perhaps fears he could not voice. In the late afternoon, a sound startled them both, the crack of a branch underfoot, deliberate and heavy. The girl froze, her heart pounding, and the man moved with a swiftness that belied his measured calm, placing himself between her and the ridge. From the shadows of the brush, a rider emerged. Cloaked in dust and sun-faded leather, their face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. They slowed as they approached the edge of the fields, their movements careful, measured, as if testing the response of those they confronted. The man did not speak immediately. He stood tall, his hands relaxed but ready, and for a long moment the two assessed each other in silence. Then the rider removed the hat, revealing the weathered face of a traveler who had clearly seen much and whose eyes carried both suspicion and calculation. "I mean no harm," the rider said finally, their voice calm but edged with caution. "I seek shelter and water for my horse. The trail ahead is long and treacherous." The girl felt a shiver run through her. There was something in the rider's tone, a subtle hesitation that made her wonder if the words could be trusted. The man studied the traveler carefully, his eyes narrowing, and then motioned for them to follow to the edge of the creek. The tension did not ease as the traveler dismounted, and though he handed water to the horse and spoke politely, there was a caution in every gesture, a sense that the home she had come to rely on was fragile and could be tested at any moment. As the rider left, the girl realized the land itself carried lessons in patience and vigilance. She asked the man about the path the traveler had taken, curious despite her fear. He shook his head slowly, his eyes returning to the horizon. "They travel lightly, but they leave traces," he said. "Some seek help, some seek trouble. The land tells me which is which. I do not always welcome either, but I watch, always." Her curiosity was piqued, and for the first time, she saw the depth of the balance he maintained between trust and caution, between solitude and the unpredictability of the outside world. She began to understand that her presence here was not just a matter of survival, but of learning how to read not just the land, but the people who passed through it, carrying intentions hidden beneath measured words. That night, sleep was uneasy. She could not shake the memory of the rider, the feeling of distant eyes watching, and the shadow of uncertainty that had begun to settle over the home. When she rose to fetch water from the creek, she noticed tracks in the soft earth footprints that did not match the rider's, smaller, lighter, and oddly deliberate. The man appeared silently beside her, moving with the same quiet authority that had become familiar. He studied the prints for a long moment, and though he did not speak, the weight of unspoken warning hung between them. Days passed in a rhythm that was both familiar and tense. The girl learned more about the household, how to hunt for small game, how to preserve food for the coming weeks, how to anticipate changes in weather and land. She observed the man's habits, his respect for the past, the quiet grief he carried, and the subtle signs of alertness that never left him. And she learned something about herself, that fear could sharpen awareness, that effort could bring a sense of belonging, and that even in a home shaped by solitude and sorrow, there could be small victories of understanding. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in gold, the man spoke of his past in greater detail, though carefully, revealing fragments of who he had been before loss reshaped his life. He told of raids on the land, of neighboring settlements in conflict, of choices made in moments of desperation and courage. The girl listened, enthralled and unsettled, sensing that each story carried more than memory, it carried warning, lessons, and the shaping of a man who had survived in a world that often demanded more than one could give. Yet there were hints of a wider tension, threads she did not yet grasp. He spoke of rival groups who contested the land, of whispers of strangers with uncertain loyalty, of matters that required vigilance even when the day seemed calm. She realized that the home, the land, and the man himself were caught in a delicate balance between peace and disruption, a balance that could tilt with a single misstep or a careless word. Late, one night, a commotion stirred at the edge of the property. The girl awoke to the sound of muffled voices, the faint flash of lanterns moving in the distance. Her heart raced, and instinctively she moved toward the doorway, only to find the man already there, his eyes scanning the dark beyond. "They are close," he whispered. "I cannot tell if they mean harm yet, but the wind carries a warning. Stay inside and keep the fire low. Do not make noise." The girl nodded, gripping the edge of the doorway as shadows shifted across the fields. From inside the house, she could see the faint glow of lanterns approaching, the sound of voices carried on the wind, careful but insistent. Her mind raced. Who were these people? Travelers, strangers, enemies? And what did it mean for her, for the man, for the fragile sense of safety she had begun to feel here? The tension mounted through the night. Every rustle of leaves, every distant call of an animal, every flicker of movement beyond the windows set her pulse racing. She watched the man move with quiet authority, checking the locks, adjusting the fire, positioning tools within reach. There was a precision in his actions that spoke of experience, and yet, even with all his vigilance, she could sense the uncertainty that lay beneath the surface. Morning came with no resolution. The visitors had moved on, leaving only disturbed earth and the faint echo of voices on the wind. The girl felt both relief and unease, understanding that their presence had been a test, a reminder that life in this place was never free of threat. She saw the man's expression as he surveyed the land alert, calculating, a mixture of caution and something else she could not name. The days that followed carried new challenges. She learned to read the land with more care, to notice the smallest signs of movement, to anticipate the changes that could signal danger. She watched the man interact with neighboring settlements when supplies were needed, observing the way respect and wariness intertwined in each encounter. And she began to feel the weight of her own role, no longer just a visitor or a burden, but a participant in a world where awareness and endurance were essential to survival. Yet beneath the rhythm of work and observation, a sense of uncertainty persisted. There were whispers in the wind, glimpses of figures at the edge of the fields, hints of stories the man would not tell, and the constant reminder that the land was alive with hidden challenges. The girl realized that belonging here would demand more than labor and attention. It would require trust, courage, and a willingness to face the unknown, even when fear pressed close. The man, for his part, began to allow moments of shared conversation, teaching her lessons about the land, about survival, and about the strength that comes from knowing one's place in the world. But he remained guarded, as if each story he shared carried only the surface truth, leaving the deeper currents hidden. She sensed that he bore burdens too heavy to voice, and that the safety she felt was fragile, contingent on a balance she could only begin to understand. And so life continued, a mixture of routine and tension, of small victories and quiet warnings. Each day brought new lessons, new signs, and new reminders that the world beyond the home was unpredictable and often unforgiving. The girl felt herself changing, growing in awareness and resilience, yet always aware that the security she experienced was provisional, dependent on vigilance, trust, and the uncertain intentions of those who moved through the land. The land itself seemed to watch, patient and unyielding, shaping every decision, every step, every choice. The girl began to understand that this was more than a home, more than a refuge. It was a test, a crucible in which fear and courage, trust and suspicion, grief and hope were constantly measured against each other. And in this crucible, she and the man shared a bond of necessity, of silent understanding, of survival, even as the threads of danger and uncertainty wove ever closer around them. Even as she worked and learned, she could not shake the sense that something waited beyond the horizon, something that would challenge the fragile balance of their lives. She saw it in the way the wind shifted, in the way the shadows stretched, in the way the man's gaze lingered on the hills with quiet intensity. The tension was unrelenting, a constant presence that reminded her that life in this place was never simple, never safe, and never predictable. And so, with the sun dipping low and the air thick with the scent of earth and smoke, she stood at the edge of the field, the man at her side, both aware of the unseen forces that moved in the distance. The land, the wind, the shadows all seemed to hold their breath, waiting for what was to come. The girl felt a mixture of fear and anticipation, knowing that her journey had only begun, that the challenges ahead would test every ounce of her strength, and that the home she had come to rely on was as fragile as it was vital. The horizon remained uncertain, the night ahead uncharted, and the story of her life in this place continued, shaped by mystery, danger, and the fragile bonds that tethered her to the man who had taken her in. And though she did not know what awaited them, she understood one truth with clarity: nothing here would be simple, nothing here would be certain, and every day would demand courage, vigilance, and a willingness to face the unknown. The wind had changed that evening, carrying with it a sharpness that cut through the twilight. Shadows stretched long across the fields, the trees whispering secrets in the dim light. The girl stood near the edge of the porch, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, staring into the hills beyond. She had grown more alert over the days, more aware of the land, of its patterns, of the subtle signs that whispered of danger and opportunity alike. Yet, even with this growing skill, a knot of unease had settled deep in her chest, tightening with each passing moment. The man emerged from the house, his boots crunching softly on the dirt path. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the horizon as though expecting the world to shift in an instant. He did not speak at first, allowing the quiet to stretch, letting the girl feel the tension that had begun to settle in the air. She realized then that the calm she had once believed in was only a fragile mask, and that the home, the land, and even the man's presence were constantly poised on the edge of uncertainty. "They are coming," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "I saw movement at first light, riders more than one. They know of this place?" Her heart lurched and she gripped the edge of the railing, knuckles white. She had heard tales of conflict before, whispers of men who roamed the land in search of power, revenge, or opportunity. And now, those stories were no longer distant. They were here, closing in, tangible and immediate. "What do we do?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper, though she fought to steady it. He studied her for a long moment, eyes unreadable. Then, with deliberate calm, he began outlining a plan. They would move quietly, securing the animals, checking the fences, ensuring the house itself was ready. Every action had weight, every choice mattered. The girl followed, her movements careful, internalizing every instruction, though the fear that coiled within her refused to settle. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the land bathed in shades of violet and gold. From the ridge, she thought she saw flickers of movement lanterns or the glint of metal in the last rays of sunlight. Each shift of shadow seemed to carry intent, each rustle of brush a warning. She moved beside him in silence, aware that the coming night would test everything she had learned, everything she had become. As darkness settled fully, the sounds of the wild seemed sharper. The cry of a distant owl, the rustle of leaves, the subtle shift of the horses in the corral all took on a new significance. Then, in the quiet, the girl heard it, the distant thrum of hooves, deliberate and steady, approaching from the ridge. The man froze, hand on the handle of a knife at his side, his eyes narrowing into slits. "They are near," he whispered. Stay inside. Do not make noise. She followed him, heart hammering as they moved to the safety of the house. Inside, every movement was careful, every sound measured. The lanterns were lowered, the windows secured. The girl could feel the tension coiling around them like a living thing, a presence that pressed close and demanded attention. Her pulse raced, and yet she sensed a strange focus sharpening within her, a readiness she had never known before. Outside, the riders paused at the edge of the fields. Voices were muffled, but the intention was clear. They were searching, moving with purpose, testing the boundaries of the land. The girl peered through a crack in the shutter, seeing the glint of steel and the movement of figures that seemed to blend with the shadows. Her stomach twisted, and for a moment she wished she had never come here, that she had stayed in the familiar misery of her old home. Yet that thought lasted only a moment, replaced by the understanding that she had no choice but to face what was before her. The man moved silently among the rooms, checking doors, adjusting positions, making sure every detail was accounted for. He glanced at her, and in his eyes she saw both trust and expectation. She was part of this now, whether she was ready or not. Every instinct, every lesson, every careful observation she had made over the past days would be tested in the coming hours. The riders began to move closer. One dismounted, stepping lightly into the shadows of the trees, while another remained mounted, scanning the land. The girl could feel her breath catching in her throat, every sense alert. She could hear the subtle sounds of approach, the shift of leather, the crunch of dirt, the faint scrape of metal. The house seemed impossibly small, a fragile barrier between them and the unknown. Then, as if sensing the tension inside, the man spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do not move unless I tell you. Trust the land." "Trust what you have learned?" Her heart pounded. She had learned to read the wind, the land, the subtle movements of animals and people alike, but now it mattered more than ever. She knew she could not falter. She had to be present, aware, ready. The first rider stepped closer, lantern in hand. His shadow stretched across the ground, flickering in the firelight. The girl held her breath, feeling the tension grip her entirely. Every second seemed to stretch into eternity. Then the second rider, moving with equal caution, began circling the perimeter. The man remained calm, but the sharpness in his eyes betrayed the gravity of the situation. Hours seemed to pass in this suspended state. The girl's mind raced, imagining possibilities, weighing dangers, anticipating movements. She realized that every detail mattered, the way a door closed, the sound of a step, the flicker of light against the trees. She was no longer a passive observer in this home. She was part of the defense, part of the tension that held the night in suspense. Suddenly, a rustle from the trees drew her attention. One of the riders had approached the fence more closely than she thought possible. The man moved, swift and precise, positioning himself to intercept. She felt the fear and anticipation coiling together, a sharp, almost physical weight pressing against her chest. The rider spoke then, a voice carried on the wind. "We know someone is here. Come out and no one will be harmed." The man's jaw tightened, but he did not respond immediately. His eyes measured the rider, assessing tone, intent, the subtle hints of hesitation or confidence. Then he spoke, voice low, deliberate. "This is my home. You will leave now or face the consequences." The threat hung in the air. The girl's stomach tightened, and for a moment she felt the overwhelming weight of what was at stake. The home, the land, the fragile bond she had begun to feel all threatened by the unknown intentions of those beyond the fence. She realized that every choice the man made now, every calculation, could mean safety or disaster. The riders hesitated. One of them dismounted fully, moving toward the house with careful steps. The man shifted slightly, ready, every muscle alert. The girl felt her pulse racing, every instinct on high alert. She remembered every lesson, every warning, every observation, and held herself steady, aware that one misstep could change everything. Minutes passed like hours. The tension was a living thing, pressing close, demanding attention, demanding courage. And in the quiet, she began to see a strange clarity. This was the moment all her preparation had led to, the culmination of every fear and lesson, every small act of courage and vigilance. She was part of it now, entwined with the land, the man, and the unknown that pressed against them from every side. Suddenly, a shout rang out from the ridge. The riders had realized they were not alone. The man reacted instantly, positioning himself between the girl and the approaching figures, ready to defend, to protect, to do whatever was needed. She felt a surge of adrenaline, fear sharpened by the awareness that she was standing at the edge of something immense, something that could change the course of her life entirely. The riders moved closer, their intentions clearer now, yet still shrouded in uncertainty. The man's eyes were sharp, calculating, measuring every step. The girl felt her heartbeat in her ears, the land itself seeming to hold its breath. Every moment was stretched taut, every possibility alive with consequence. And then, as if the night itself waited in anticipation, the first figure stepped forward, lantern casting long shadows, the others following carefully. The tension was unbearable, a knife edge stretched across the quiet land. She could feel it in every fiber of her being, the anticipation, the fear, the awareness that the climax of the story of this chapter of her life was finally here. The man raised a hand, signaling caution, his gaze never leaving the approaching riders. She mirrored his focus, aware that her presence mattered, that every movement could influence the outcome. The night seemed endless, the suspense unrelenting, as the home, the land, and the fragile bonds between them all waited for the inevitable collision of forces. Every sound, every shadow, every movement was magnified in the silence. She could feel the story teetering on the brink, the tension building to a point where resolution or disaster loomed near, just out of reach. And as the first lantern light neared the edge of the porch, she realized that everything she had learned, every lesson, every fear, every step toward trust and courage would now be tested to its fullest extent. The night was alive with suspense. The horizon, the shadows, the land itself seemed to pulse with the anticipation of what was to come. And inside the house, the girl and the man waited, poised, alert, their bond unspoken yet undeniable, standing at the threshold of a climax that would demand everything they had and more. The riders paused, the wind shifted. And the story, suspended in the tension of the moment, held its breath, leaving the girl, the widower, and the audience on the edge of revelation, every detail magnified, every heartbeat counted, every shadow pregnant with possibility. The first lantern flickered against the wooden porch, and the man's hand rested on the hilt of his knife, steady and deliberate. The riders were close now, their intentions no longer hidden, but the tension that had gripped the night began to shift in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. One of the figures spoke again, a voice carried on the wind, firm yet cautious. "We mean no lasting harm. We only sought the path through these lands." The man's gaze never wavered. He measured the words, the tone, the posture, and found truth there. Slowly, he lowered his hand, and the knife's edge caught the lantern light for a moment before disappearing back into its sheath. The girl's breath, held for so long, exhaled in a long shiver, a mixture of relief and disbelief. She had feared conflict, imagined danger at every corner, but here was the first sign that understanding and caution could coexist, that not every challenge demanded battle. The riders dismounted fully, moving closer with deliberate care. The man stepped forward to meet them, his posture calm but authoritative. Words were exchanged, brief and careful, conveying intentions, clarifying boundaries, and setting terms that would allow the night to end without violence. The girl listened from the doorway, heart still racing, feeling a new sense of respect and awe for the man who had navigated this encounter with precision and restraint. He was fearsome when needed, but measured always by the depth of wisdom that came from living close to the land and its lessons. Once the riders moved on, leaving behind only the disturbed earth and the faint scent of leather and horse, the girl and the man remained for a long moment in the quiet that followed. The wind shifted gently, carrying the scent of earth, smoke, and the distant hills. It was as though the land itself exhaled, relieved that the tension had passed without harm. She felt a warmth in her chest, a mixture of gratitude and newfound courage. For the first time, she recognized her own resilience, the strength that had grown quietly within her over the weeks she had lived here. The man turned to her then, eyes softening with a rare expression. "You stayed calm?" he said simply. You watched, you learned, and you did not falter. That is no small thing. She lowered her gaze, cheeks flushing. I was scared, she admitted, voice barely above a whisper, but I wanted to do what was right. I wanted to help. He nodded, a faint smile tracing the line of his lips. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is acting even when fear is present. You have learned that well? The girl felt a surge of pride and relief. She had arrived in this home uncertain, unwanted, and afraid. Her parents had abandoned her for reasons she could not change, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a fragile spark of hope. And yet, in this house, in the presence of a man shaped by grief and wisdom, she had found purpose, belonging, and the quiet confidence that she could face the unknown. The following days settled into a rhythm that felt different than before. The land remained watchful, every shadow carrying lessons, but the girl moved with a new sense of ease. She tended the fields, cared for the animals, and learned the subtle art of reading the weather, the earth, and the distant hills. The man guided her, teaching without force, allowing her to discover her own strength. And in the quiet moments, when the sun dipped low and the sky bled amber and rose, they would sit together, sharing stories of the past, of hardship and endurance, and sometimes of simple joys that had been long forgotten. The girl began to explore the surrounding hills more confidently. She found hidden paths, small springs, and quiet glades where the wind carried only the sound of the creek and the rustle of leaves. Each discovery deepened her connection to the land and to the home she now called her own. She understood that this place was more than a refuge, it was a teacher, a guardian, and a mirror of the resilience she had cultivated within herself. One morning, as she was gathering herbs near the creek, she saw him watching her from a distance, his posture relaxed yet alert. She waved, and he smiled, a small, genuine expression that held more warmth than words could convey. For the first time, she felt a sense of family, not through blood, but through trust, shared experience, and quiet respect. She realized that the bonds that formed here were stronger than any imposed by heritage or expectation. They were earned through courage, patience, and understanding. The man began to share more of his past, though carefully, revealing not just tales of hardship, but moments of love, joy, and even humor. He spoke of his wife, not only in sorrow but in remembrance of the strength and laughter she had brought to the home. He told her of days spent hunting and fishing, of nights under the stars with friends long gone, and of lessons learned from the land itself. Through these stories, the girl came to see him not only as protector and teacher, but as a man capable of great depth of heart. The girl also began to open herself to the home and its routines. She cooked meals with care, learning the subtle flavors of herbs and spices, and helped mend fences and tools, her hands no longer trembling with inexperience. She realized that the tasks she once saw as labor were expressions of belonging, ways to care for the land and the man who had taken her in. Every action became a statement of purpose, a declaration that she was no longer the abandoned girl she had been sent away as. As spring began to bloom across the land, the home felt alive in a new way. The fields were green and fertile, the animals healthy and thriving, and the creek carried a sparkling vitality that mirrored the girl's own renewed spirit. The man observed the growth around them, and she noticed, in fleeting moments, a softness in his eyes when he looked at her, a subtle acknowledgement of the bond they had forged through shared trials and triumphs. One afternoon, a small group of neighbors approached the property, cautious but respectful. The girl had learned to read their approach, noting the subtle gestures of hesitation and respect. The man met them with calm authority, speaking openly and kindly. She watched as trust was built, not through force, but through demonstration of strength, fairness, and integrity. The tension that had once hovered on the edge of the land had eased, replaced by a sense of community, fragile but growing, rooted in shared respect and understanding. In the evenings, the girl and the man would sit by the fire, sharing moments of quiet conversation. Sometimes they spoke of the past, sometimes of the land, and sometimes in silence, content in each other's company. The girl realized that the fear and uncertainty that had accompanied her arrival had transformed into confidence and connection. She had found a place in this home, not as a burden but as a vital part of its rhythm, its heartbeat, and its future. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, the man turned to her with a rare seriousness. "You have done well," he said, voice low and steady. "Not just in surviving, but in becoming part of this place. You have learned the land, respected it, and made it your own. That is no small accomplishment." She smiled, feeling a warmth that went beyond the simple pleasure of praise. She had arrived abandoned, uncertain, and afraid. She had faced danger, uncertainty, and the weight of her past, and yet she had emerged stronger, more capable, and more certain of her place in the world. She realized that she was no longer defined by what she had lacked, but by what she had cultivated: courage, understanding, and the willingness to step forward into the unknown. The days that followed carried a quiet joy. The home thrived, the land responded to care and attention, and the girl found herself thinking less of the past she had left behind and more of the life she was building. The man continued to teach and guide, but he also began to rely on her in ways small and significant, trusting her judgment, valuing her insight, and sharing the burdens of the land. Together they maintained the home, the fields, and the animals, each day strengthening the bond that had grown between them. Spring turned to summer, and with it came a sense of permanence and belonging. The girl realized that she was no longer living in fear, but in awareness, appreciation, and quiet confidence. She had been abandoned once, cast aside for circumstances she could not control. Yet here she had found not only safety and purpose, but a sense of family and connection that transcended the limitations of blood. One evening, as the sun set and the sky glowed with the soft pink of twilight, the girl and the man stood together on the porch, watching the fields and hills bathed in the last light of the day. The wind carried the scent of earth and wildflowers, and the world felt at once vast and intimate. She turned to him, a smile tugging at her lips, and realized that she had found a home, a place of belonging, and a life shaped by courage, resilience, and quiet strength. The man glanced at her, a faint smile breaking the lines of his face, and for a long moment they stood in silence, sharing the unspoken understanding that they had both found something rare and valuable: a sense of peace, a bond forged in trials, and the knowledge that together they could face whatever the future might hold. The land around them seemed to exhale, the wind shifting gently, carrying away the shadows that had once hovered at the edges of their home. The creek sparkled in the last light, the animals settled quietly, and the fields stood lush and alive. The girl felt the weight of her past lift, replaced by a sense of accomplishment, belonging, and hope. She had arrived abandoned and afraid, yet she had found not only safety, but purpose, family, and the quiet joy of a life fully lived. And as the stars began to appear one by one, glimmering above the hills and fields, she knew that this was only the beginning of a life filled with challenges, growth, and joy. But for now, the home was safe, the land thriving, and the bond between them strong, a testament to courage, resilience, and the enduring power of trust and connection. The girl smiled, feeling the warmth of the home, the strength of the man beside her, and the beauty of the land she now called her own. She had survived, learned, and grown, and in the quiet of the night she understood that she was finally home.